Ethan Cole stood at the far end of the long glass conference table, his palms slightly damp but his posture steady as he faced a room full of executives in downtown Chicago. The skyline stretched behind them through massive windows, a reminder of the scale of ambition that filled the company and the stakes tied to this very moment. Ethan adjusted the cuff of his worn but neatly pressed shirt and clicked to the next slide of his presentation. Weeks of preparation had gone into this. Late nights after putting his 7-year-old daughter to bed, early mornings before sunrise, and every spare minute spent refining numbers, projections, and strategy. This wasn't just another proposal. It was his chance to finally be seen. He began explaining his idea with quiet confidence, outlining a new partnership strategy that could bring in major clients the company had been struggling to secure. His voice was calm, measured, but underneath it carried the weight of everything he stood to gain or lose. Around the table, some executives glanced at their tablets. Others leaned back in their chairs with mild interest. Ethan noticed it but pressed on, determined not to let their indifference shake him. He had learned long ago that respect wasn't given easily. It had to be earned, especially for someone like him, who didn't come from elite business schools or powerful connections. As he spoke, his mind briefly drifted to his daughter Lily. That morning, she had hugged him tightly before school and said, "You'll degrade, Dad." That simple sentence echoed in his head, now grounding him. Everything he did was for her, for stability, for a better future, for the promise that their struggles wouldn't last forever. Ethan clicked to the most critical slide, the one that tied his entire strategy together. If we position ourselves as a flexible partner rather than a rigid vendor, he explained, we can attract mid-tier clients ready to scale. I've already identified 3 potential leads. That's enough. The voice cut through the room like a blade. Ethan froze mid-sentence at the head of the table. CEO Richard Halverson leaned forward, his expression sharp, unimpressed. The room fell silent instantly. I've heard enough, Halverson continued, his tone cold. This proposal is amateur at best. Do you really think this is the level of thinking we expect in this room? Ethan felt his chest tighten. But he tried to respond, sir. If I could just explain the projections. You've explained more than enough, Halverson interrupted, raising a hand dismissively. A few executives avoided eye contact, while others watched with thinly veiled curiosity. This is a waste of time. We don't bring people in here to present half-baked ideas. A faint heat crept up Ethan's neck as the weight of humiliation began to settle in. He opened his mouth again, but no words came out. The confidence he had built over weeks seemed to crumble in seconds. Halverson pressed a button on the table security. The word hung heavy in the air. Ethan blinked, unsure if he had heard correctly. But within moments, 2 uniformed guards appeared at the door. Escort Mr. Cool out, the CEO said flatly. This meeting is over for him. A murmur spread across the room. Ethan stood frozen for a second, his mind struggling to process what was happening. He had expected criticism, maybe even rejection, but not this. Not in front of everyone, not like this. Slowly, he reached down and gathered his papers, his fingers trembling just slightly. He avoided looking directly at anyone, though he could feel their eyes on him, some sympathetic, others indifferent, a few quietly judgmental. The guards waited politely but firmly, making it clear there was no room for argument. As Ethan turned toward the door, his gaze briefly flickered back to the screen displaying his presentation. The hours of effort now reduced to nothing more than a dismissed idea. For a moment, doubt crept in. Maybe it wasn't good enough. Maybe he wasn't good enough. But then just as quickly another thought pushed through. He remembered every late night, every calculation, every conversation that had shaped this plan. He remembered the contact who had once told him, "If no one listens, you're talking to the wrong room." Ethan straightened his shoulders slightly. Without saying a word, he walked out of the boardroom, the door closing behind him with a quiet but final click. The hallway outside felt colder, quieter. For a few seconds he just stood there, staring at the floor, letting the sting of the moment wash over him. Humiliation, anger, disappointment. They all swirled together. But beneath them, something else began to form. Something steadier, stronger. He exhaled slowly and slipped his papers into his worn leather folder. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. His thumb hovered over the screen for a moment before scrolling to a name he hadn't contacted in years. A former client, someone who had once believed in his ideas when no one else had. Ethan hesitated for just a second longer, then pressed call as the phone rang. He lifted his head, his expression no longer defeated but focused. Whatever had just happened in that room didn't have to be the end of his story. If anything, it might just be the beginning of something bigger than he had imagined. In this time, he wouldn't need their approval to prove his worth. The next morning, the same boardroom carried a different kind of tension. Quieter, uncertain, almost expectant sunlight filtered through the tall glass windows, reflecting off the polished table where executives had already gathered, murmuring among themselves. News had spread quickly that a major client representative was coming in for an unscheduled meeting, but no one seemed to know the full story. At the head of the table, CEO Richard Halverson sat, composed as ever, though the slight tapping of his fingers betrayed his impatience. The door opened and conversation stopped instantly. Ethan Cole stepped inside. For a brief moment, no one spoke. The same man who had been escorted out the day before now walked in with calm confidence, dressed in the same modest suit but carrying himself differently. There was no hesitation in his stride, no trace of the uncertainty that had followed him out of the room. Behind him were two sharply dressed representatives from a well-known regional firm, their presence alone enough to shift the atmosphere. Halvorson's eyes narrowed slightly. "Mr. Cool," he said. His tone controlled. "This is unexpected." Ethan nodded politely. "I appreciate you allowing us a few minutes," he replied, his voice steady. "I believe this will be worth everyone's time." Before the CEO could respond, one of the representatives stepped forward and placed a folder on the table. "We've reviewed Mr. Cole's proposal," she said, clearly addressing the room, "and we're prepared to move forward." A subtle ripple of surprise passed through the executives. Papers were exchanged, opened. Scanned numbers were checked twice. Then a third time. The figure stood out immediately, $3 million. Silence followed. Ethan moved to the screen and, without rushing, began outlining the same strategy he had tried to present the day before, but this time the room listened. Every detail landed differently, now validated by the presence of real clients ready to commit. He explained the flexibility of the model, the scalability, the long-term value, not as theory but as an agreement already in motion. Halvorson leaned back slightly, his earlier confidence replaced by something more guarded. "In this contract," he said slowly, "is with my firm," Ethan answered simply. That was the moment it truly sank in. Ethan wasn't there as an employee anymore. He wasn't asking for approval nor seeking validation. He had taken the same idea, the same work they had dismissed, and turned it into something real, something valuable on his own terms. One of the executives cleared his throat. "You're saying this deal could have been ours?" Ethan met his gaze not with arrogance, but with quiet certainty. It could have been. He said if it had been given a chance. No one spoke after that. The weight of realization settled across the room, the rejection, the dismissal, the public humiliation. It all echoed differently now. What had seemed like authority the day before now looked like oversight. What had been labeled amateur now carried a multi-million-dollar price tag. Ethan closed the folder gently and stepped back. "I didn't come here to prove anyone wrong," he added. "I came to move forward." With that, he turned slightly toward the representatives, continuing the conversation on equal footing, no longer beneath anyone in the room. And as the executives sat in silence, one truth became impossible to ignore. Ethan hadn't just returned, he had risen beyond them.